Welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. And now, here's Chris McCann.
Good evening and welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Bible study in the book of Genesis. Tonight is study number 15 of Genesis chapter 14. We're going to begin reading in verse 11. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals and went their way. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And there came one that had escaped, and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house 318, and pursued them unto Dan. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants by night, and smote them, and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot, and his goods, and the women also, and the people. And I'll stop reading there. So we have seen, as we've followed through in this chapter, and followed the historical account, that Chedorlaomer and 3 kings with him came to battle against the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar, because these city-states had rebelled against Chedorlaomer, and it was after 12 years of serving him. In the 13th year they rebelled, in the 14th year they came. And we saw how all those numbers identify with the time, the exact time that the Great Tribulation period started, after 12,000 complete years, figuratively, 11,000 to the Messiah, 1,000 of Satan's binding, 12,000 total. Yet, actually, after 13,000 years, in the 14,000th year, the beginning of that, which the days of the Great Tribulation were, then the spiritual battle took place between the forces of Satan who had been loosed and the forces within the churches and congregations of the world that had been abandoned by God. And it was no contest. Satan's forces overcame the camp of the saints. They were victorious, and they caused to fall Sodom and Gomorrah, and these collection of city-states were really picturing the fall of the corporate church. The churches fell and fled. They were completely wiped out, destroyed. They were beaten as badly as Israel was beaten before the Philistines in that terrible time when the ark of God was taken and the glory had departed from Israel. But within the church, there was a remnant, and Zoar's presence in this battle is representative of the remnant or God's elect within the corporate church during the Great Tribulation period, when judgment began at the house of God and Satan's forces came against the forces of the church. Well, involved in that were God's elect, his truly saved people, and eventually the Lord opened up the command for them to flee to the mountains. And so we read at the end of verse 10, and they that remain fled to the mountain. But then it says in verse 11, and they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals and went their way. And this is referring to the four kings led by Chedorlaomer that typify Satan and his emissaries. They took captive the people of these cities. They also took their goods, and we'll look up that word in a little bit, and their victuals, and went their way. Now, if that were all that they had done, if it were just the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah and their goods and victuals, well, then Abram would not have gotten involved. He was just a sojourner, Abram was, and he lived at a distance. He did not live in the land of the plain. The fight between the four kings against five was really none of Abram's business, and he would have much preferred to stay out of it. But we also read in verse 12 that the four kings, Chedorlaomer, king of nations, and so forth, they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And you see, now that makes it a completely different matter, because amongst the captives, there was a close relative to Abram, his nephew Lot. And amongst the goods that they had taken, there were goods that belonged to Lot. And this made the battle and the conquest of Chedorlaomer and the other kings over Sodom and Gomorrah Abram's concern. Again, otherwise, he would not have gotten involved. It did not have anything to do with him until they took Lot and Lot's possessions. Then Abram had a family obligation. He had a family responsibility to do something to rescue his nephew. And that's what we read here in verse 13. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants, by night, and smote them, and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot, and his goods, and the women also, and the people. Abram intervened. He gathered his trained and armed servants, and he had quite a number of them, 318, and they went after, they pursued Chedorlaomer and these other kings in order to deliver Lot and to recover his goods. It sort of gives us an overall view of the battle we didn't have before, because numbers had not been really introduced concerning this battle, concerning the four kings against five. We weren't sure of numbers of people, but here we see that Abram, with 300, and actually three other men that were mentioned in verse 13, Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner, for a total of 322 men, and we'll talk about that number another time. But a total of 322 men pursued these four kings that had won the battle over the cities of the plain, and they defeated them and rescued Lot and all the other people too, and also restored the goods. So, well, it doesn't give us an exact idea, because it is possible in the Bible for a smaller force to defeat a greater force. Actually, that happens fairly regularly when the force has God on their side. Like, for instance, Gideon had 300 when he came against a huge host, and yet by God's power, he defeated them when they designed a plan to sound the trumpet and to break these pitchers that would show forth lanterns or lighted candles in the midst of the night. And that caused the enemy army to run over themselves in fleeing, and they were just terribly defeated. But again, it was only 300 men, and we could also think of David against Goliath, or Saul's son Jonathan against a Philistine outpost, and how many men he slew at once, or Samson, who slew 1,000 men with the jawbone of an ass. And we do find that oftentimes the few, because they represent God's people, the elect of God, that they are victorious over a great many. And so it doesn't give us an exact number of forces that Chedorlaomer and the four kings had, when we understand that they were defeated by an army, a personal army of Abram, trained in his own house, of only 322 men. It's possible that the armies of these four kings only numbered perhaps 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000, and maybe they had already lost many casualties in the battle against the five kings, and perhaps they were in a weakened condition, and they were caught by surprise as Abram did gather his men and divide himself and come at them by night, and they weren't expecting it. So when you put it all together, it's possible that Abram and his 322, including himself, defeated a force of maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. They could have ran at them in the night. Maybe they had horses. We're not told all the information about the battle, and it could be many of them fled, or they were just killed by Abram and his servants. But however it worked out, Abram overcame Chedorlaomer and title King of Nations, and he overcame Arioch, king of Elasar, and Amraphel, king of Shinar. Chedorlaomer was king of Elam. The four kings that identify with Babylon, the four kings that identify with the four beasts, or Satan's rule during the Great Tribulation period, Abram overcame them and defeated them. And as we have been discussing, as the historical situation has laid out the spiritual teaching that identifies with the timing of the Great Tribulation and the battle between the four kings and five, the actual Great Tribulation, well then, what would Abram's gathering of forces and coming against these four kings and defeating them point to? It would point to the end of the Great Tribulation, the defeat of Satan, and the release of the captives. Just as at the end of 70 years historically, with that historical type of the Great Tribulation, when Babylon came against Judah, at its completion, after 70 years, Babylon was defeated. The king of Babylon was slain, and the new king, Cyrus of the Medes and the Persians, he made a proclamation to set the Jewish captives free. They could return to the land of Judah. And so we see at the end of the 70-year Babylonian captivity, there was deliverance to the captives. And likewise, at the end of the actual Great Tribulation period, after 23 years, God delivered all spiritual captives that had been held in bondage to sin and to Satan. All of the elect were now delivered through salvation and free. And so we see elements of that. Of course, this is a small battle that now has a second aspect to the battle. There was the battle between 4 kings against 5. Abram played no part. He played no part in that battle. He didn't come with his trained men to help Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboam, and Zoar. He didn't help them against Chedorlaomer so that Chedorlaomer would never win the battle. No, Abram stayed out of it. Just as God stayed out of the battle between Satan against the church. God stayed out of it in the sense he did not fight for the churches and congregations against the forces of Satan. And as a matter of fact, God is the one that loosed Satan to bring him as his servant, carrying out his will of spiritually bringing destruction to the corporate church. God was behind it and permitted it to happen and was not fighting on the side of the church. But he made sure that Satan would win the battle and overcome the camp of the saints. But again, here, now with this growing historical picture, another element to the battle that's already been fought and won by the 4 kings over the 5. Now we have like a side note. We have an additional information that is being revealed because this points to what happens after the tribulation. That once the tribulation completes, and it's only during the Great Tribulation, its 23-year period, that Satan is victorious. It's only throughout the 23 years that Satan is the overcomer of the camp of the saints. And he wins battle after battle. He is winning that war. But again, immediately upon the completion of the Great Tribulation, Satan is defeated. His forces are now overcome. He himself is deposed and put down, and the captives are free. The captives are free. The release of the prisoners, as we see in the book of Acts, takes place spiritually. And all of that is in view as this historical parable is conveying all these things long ago, thousands of years ago, yet God wrote them in such a way so that they could be types and figures of what would actually take place during the end of the church age and God's judgment upon the churches and congregations of the world, and then upon the completion of that judgment process as there occurred a transition from judgment which began at the house of God and then moved on into a judgment upon all the unsaved inhabitants of the earth. And that's exactly where we find ourselves today in these days after the tribulation, after May 21, 2011. Well, Lord willing, in our next study, we're going to look a little bit closer at the goods that were taken from Sodom and Gomorrah and also from Lot, and the victuals that are spoken of, and we'll see what that has to do with spiritually.
Thank you for joining us for eBible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies and information, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. Until our next Bible study, may the Lord's perfect will be done.